Tonight we began learning together a talk of the Lubavitcher Rebbe on war, peace, how we understand our current times. So when we look at what's going on in our world today, 2022, what's going on in Ukraine? How do we understand it? We can look at it through the prism of the Rebbe's vision. And that gives us a lot of security.
Please subscribe and share.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'nasan lanu es toraso. Baruch atah Adonai nosein haTorah. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai echad. So I was thinking, be nice to take another bit of time to learn something that the Rebbe spoke. I was thinking this war keeps going on and on and on. You know, as we have, if you are following it, if you aren't following it, you know, and it's like, what is happening with our world and a war and, you know, everything everyone's saying about the war. So I wanted to talk about the Rebbe's perspective on war and peace and our reality. And this is a talk the Rebbe gave in 1992. This was the Rebbe's vision in 1992 about war and peace and how we're supposed to look at things in our world. And I thought it's like, listen, let's remember the true reality, because when you do follow the news, things seem even more, you know, terrifying. And if you don't follow the news, they might seem a little less intimately close to you, but it still doesn't feel very good. So this is a talk the Rebbe gave in 1992, in February of 1992. We're not going to do the whole talk, but just the parts that were relevant. So the Rebbe began that we know that everything in the world is with, of course, the term we use, hashgacha pratis. Hashgacha pratis means specific divine providence. Everything, as the Baal Shem Tov, the founder of the Hasidic movement, Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov, taught that even the movement of a blade of grass, let alone the movement of a human, let alone the movement of a Jew, is all very specifically choreographed divine providence. And therefore, we have to look at what's happening and see what lessons we can take from it, because if everything happening in our world is very specifically orchestrated by God, is very, 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 very deliberate providence, then it's there for us to look and understand and take a lesson from. And especially, the Rebbe says, when we look at things happening in the world, like big things in the world, when we look at what's happening in the world, and especially things happening connected to very big, powerful countries in the world. In 1992, there was still the term superpowers, which nowadays is sort of passé. But in those days, there was still the idea of the superpowers. So if we see something happening with these superpowers, well, we know obviously it's a very, very impactful. We know it's something that's affecting the world, which means it's something that we're supposed to look at and figure out, what is the lesson? What is God trying to tell me personally from what's happening in our world? And especially if these are countries where there's a lot of Jews in those countries. Like, of course, the superpower of America, where you have the majority of world Jewry, and of course, Russia, where you have a tremendous amount of Jews. I don't know how many Jews are still in Russia, but there's quite a lot. And of course, in the Ukraine, there's quite a lot. I don't know how many are left, but there's still quite a lot. So the Rebbe says any country that has a lot of Jews, for sure, what's happening in that country is something we definitely need to pay attention to and see what lessons can we glean. How are we supposed to process what we see happening there? Especially if we have a country that also has a tremendous influence in the world and has a lot of Jews in it, then for sure, we have to look and really think, what am I supposed to take? How am I supposed to understand what's happening? How am I supposed to process it? And what is this teaching me about my own relationship to God? Now, what the Rebbe was talking about, as the Rebbe says, is two things that happened the week of this talk. This talk the Rebbe gave on Shabbos on Saturday. And the week prior, there were things that happened that made a very big impact on the world. So the first thing that happened is that there was a very significant, first of its kind, maybe till this day, still unique, meeting that took place in the United Nations on Friday. I was speaking on Shabbos. So this was on Friday. Now, what was so unusual about this meeting? So normally in the United Nations, every nation has, of course, the representative, the ambassador of that nation who is representing the country in the United Nations. Because of the significance of the meeting that took place starting with Friday, the heads of state themselves came to the UN. Which countries? Obviously got the whole representative of the whole world. All of the countries that are in what the UN calls their Security Council. Of course, the Security Council is the most important, powerful countries of the world. So all of the countries that are in the Security Council, the heads of state came to Manhattan to meet in the UN. Why? Because they wanted to create a very significant shift in relationships. This is when this is 1992. So already deep enough into Russia's march toward freedom, so to speak. And so this was Boris Yeltsin, I believe, and George Bush, who was the president of America at that time. I think it was pretty sure it was Yeltsin, who was in Russia. So they came, basically, they were the two, big players here to create a treaty that would mark a shift in the international relationships between their countries and really in the whole world. That was on Friday. As the Rebbe says later in the talk, on Shabbos, Yeltsin and Bush met in Camp David, in this presidential area, estate, I think it's in Virginia, to continue the talks, and they also spoke there publicly. So the Rebbe said, what did these presidents, these leaders of the countries come out with? They said that we are agreeing to minimize armaments, and we want to use that money instead to help mankind, to help people of the world, and to help people very specifically economically, financially, and especially to provide food for peoples of the world. So this was the big announcement that came out on Friday from the UN, from the Security Council, from these countries. Now, preceding that, on Wednesday, there had been what's called a State of the Union address. We don't have them too often, so you might not be familiar with what that term means. But a State of the Union address is when the president wants to address the entire country. It was sort of started, I think, by Roosevelt. Like during the Depression, he would have these, what they call fireside chats, and he's like talking to the country and trying to like guide them through. So Bush had this State of the Union address where he is basically giving the same message. He is saying that he wants to minimize armaments, minimize the defense budget, and instead use that money to support people of the country. He said this, and this was ratified, meaning it was agreed to by the Senate, where, of course, the laws of the country are made. So the Rebbe said, look what happened this week. We have the biggest countries in the world meeting together to say, we want peace. We want peace in the world. We want to shrink our defense budgets. And of course, we want to use that money for something else. And we want to use that money to help people. And Bush, already like foreshadowing this, gave this same message to the country like 2 days before. I want to be the president who's going to minimize the defense budget, who's going to minimize money spent on weaponry. And I want to instead use that money to support people. So the Rebbe said, this is huge. It's interesting because I remember I was once, took my children like on a, probably was like Pesach or Sukkot, probably not Sukkot, it's probably Pesach, on my trip to the Children's Museum in downtown, if you've ever been there by Navy Pier. And they had a display, like year by year, the most significant events that happened that year. And I looked at it, and for 1992, this was on the list of like the 5 things they chose as the most significant events of the year, was this peace treaty agreed in the United Nations to shift the defense budgets of the world and instead use the money to support humanity. So the Rebbe says, when we see something like this, we have to say, so what is this teaching me? What is a lesson for me in this event? And of course you could say, what got to do with us? We're not the president. We're not running for president. We don't support the president. That's not our thing. We're not into this at all. The UN, all the UN does is bad stuff to Israel. Like, what in the world do we care about this? But the Rebbe says, no. We can't look at it like that. This is something very big happening in the world. And the big players in this, the United States and the former, USSR, they're the most biggest, powerful countries in the world. So we're talking about something huge. And both of those are countries that have a lot of Jews in them. So when big countries, powerful countries, a lot of Jews do things, there's something we need to learn from that, because nothing is random. Everything is very, very specific divine providence. I'm sure the concept here, what the Rebbe is referring to, as we say, hashgacha pratis, that everything is very, very specific divine providence, I'm sure we're all familiar with. And I'm sure you've all seen this in your life. Anyone like to share something in their life where they felt like, whoa, when they saw Hashem's hand so clearly, even in the specific details? Anyone have an example of hashgacha pratis that they've seen in their life? I mean, I think it happens like every day when we open our eyes to it. Hashgacha pratis means, now obviously everything is hashgacha pratis. What it means is that everything is intimately, specifically directed by God. So when someone says, oh my gosh, that was such hashgacha pratis, it's sort of like a weird sentence, though people say it all the time. It's a weird sentence because you're saying that's hashgacha pratis and that wasn't hashgacha pratis. The fact that I stubbed my toe wasn't hashgacha pratis, or that was hashgacha pratis, but that I opened the door with my right hand wasn't hashgacha pratis, or that the bus came early, or that the bus came late, or that I made it, or that I missed it. Every detail of the world is hashgacha pratis. Like we said, the movement of a blade of grass is hashgacha pratis. But sometimes when something happens a little bit more overtly hand of God, we're like, how did that just happen? That's what we mean when we say, oh, that's hashgacha pratis. Meaning we see, we get it, we realize that's not normal. That's because God is intimately orchestrating everything. Now, what we're supposed to realize from those events where we see God's hand intimately orchestrating is it's true everywhere, for everything. I have to tell you the story. I actually literally just heard this last night. Literally last night I heard the story. I'll try to say it briefly, because if I say it with all its details, it would take about another half hour of our class. So I don't think that's really fair to the class. But there's this girl, a religious girl, who lives in Yerushalayim, who lives in Jerusalem, an American, but she lived in Israel already for many years. Single girl. And again, saying the story briefly, she wasn't feeling well. She was sick. And a friend of hers from a different city in Israel called her and asked her if she could go to a certain spot in the mountains around Jerusalem to take a certain picture she needed for something. And the girl was really feeling very sick. Like she really should not get out of bed, let alone schlep on a bus to this certain exact spot to take this picture. But she wanted to be nice. She knew her friend needed it. I need it. It's desperate. I'm making this article. I need exactly this angle of the sun on the da. Can I do it later? No, it has to be exactly now to get exactly the right sunlight and shadow and whatever. Okay, so being a nice person, she says, fine, no problem. Of course, I'll do it for you. So she walks out of her apartment. Again, she's not feeling very well. So she's a little like not clear-headed, woozy. And she gets on a bus to a 5-minute ride. She knows in 5 minutes she's going to get off to go to this mountain to take this picture. Problem is, because she was a little woozy, 2 things happened. The first mistake that happened was she got on the wrong bus, because in Jerusalem, there are green buses and blue buses, and green buses are Jewish buses, Eged, and blue buses are Arab buses. It's a little confusing because the Israeli flag is blue, but whatever. So she was a little woozy and she got on a blue bus. But since she wasn't feeling well, she didn't realize that everyone around her was Arab. She sat down. The second problem was, because she wasn't feeling good, she promptly fell asleep. So she's on an Arab bus and she's sleeping. She doesn't realize on her bus, and she wakes up 25 minutes later. Still not realizing she's on an Arab bus. But she's like, oh my gosh, like she was supposed to get off after 5 minutes. It's 25 minutes. Like she for sure missed her stop and the picture and the light and the this and that. She jumps off the bus and she looks around and she's like, where am I? Like, where am I? She looks around and she sees everywhere, everything's plastered in Arabic, lots of signs like plastered all over the place. And all the houses look like they were about to fall over and collapse. She's like, where am I? And there was nobody on the streets. Where am I? What's going on? And it took her about a few seconds because, again, she was not feeling well, but she very quickly realized she was in East Jerusalem, which is a very dangerous place for a Jew to be, let alone a Jewish girl, let alone a Jewish girl alone. And how in the world is she going to get out? So, of course, she did what any of us would do, and she pulled out her phone. And she saw that her battery was dead. So she's alone in East Jerusalem, and she doesn't have a phone. And she realizes it's very quiet. There's no one on the streets. Where is everyone? Now, the reason why it was so quiet, which maybe that was also a hand of God to help her, because we got off in Boston, there was a bunch of Arabs there. It might have ended differently, the whole story. But everybody, there was not a soul on the street, because it was the night of Ramadan, which is when all the Arabs break their fast. So they're all home with their families having these big fast breaking parties. So there's no one on the streets, but she doesn't know how to leave. She knows she's in big trouble. So when you're Jewish and in big trouble, and if you're not Jewish also in big trouble, you start praying. So she started praying, to God, and she was just praying and praying and praying, save me. I don't know what to do. And she was praying and praying, walking, not seeing anyone on the streets, just these ramshackle homes plastered with these signs that she understood were like praising these terrorists that had died to kill Jews and all such messages. She felt very, very like, and finally she had an idea, like she didn't know what else to do. She said, you know what? She's going to stop at the first house she sees that looks okay. Meaning doesn't have any of these signs plastered over it and doesn't look like it's about to fall down and collapse. So the first house that looks like okay, she's like, that must be like the most normal people around, because they don't have all these anti-Jew signs plastered over their house, and the house itself looks normal. So probably, hopefully, normal people are there. And she's gonna pretend she's not gonna speak a word of Hebrew. She's gonna pretend she's some student from UCLA coming to do something to help the Arabs. And she's just sort of thinking, hopefully they'll buy it, and then hopefully somehow they'll get her out of East Jerusalem. Her plan was a little shaky, but she just didn't know what else to do. I mean, it sounds very dangerous to knock on some Arab's door, but it felt very dangerous to be on the streets, and it felt very dangerous not to know how to get home. And obviously it's going to get dark very soon. And then what do you do? So she kept walking, seeing ramshackle house after house, plastered with these signs, She's just walking and walking and walking until she sees a house that didn't have any signs on it. And it looked like, okay, normal. She said, okay, this is a house. And like she's praying and walking up, and she knocks on the door, and the door opens, and she's an Arab girl dressed, in the Arab clothing. And the girl looks at her. I mean, she was obviously a Jewish girl. The girl looks at her, and then the girl said, oh, Hannah. And she gives her a big hug, and she pulls her in her house. And she says to her, I still have the card. She's like, what? I'm supposed to pretend I'm not even Jewish, and I'm from UCLA, and what is going on? And how does she know my name? And what is she going to have the card? And then she pulled all the pieces together. I'm going to say the story briefly because it's already taken a long time. basically this girl, Hannah, a few months before, had been in like a 3-week retreat in a hotel in Jerusalem, some like program, to help Jews. And she had made a point that all the workers, she said to herself, I want to be very polite and nice to, and really like take an interest in them, get their names, what they're interested in. And at the end, I'm going to write each one a nice card because I can't give each one a nice tip, but I want to be like, as we call it, a mensch. So she was doing this, and the whole time she was very nice and polite to all the workers and taking down their names and their details. She had this idea she was going to write these cards. The last night she's there for 3 weeks. The last night she sees a new worker, a girl, an Arab girl, never met her before, giving out coffee. She started speaking to her. Yeah, whatever. She's wants to be a doctor. She's earning money. So a lot of relatives that work in this hotel. Okay, fine. So the next day she's writing all her cards. And she gave a card to each of the people that she had, had been helping her and, been working in the hotel for 3 weeks. She had one extra card. She's like, I've got an extra card. What should I do with it? And then she remembered the girl the night before. She said, let me do that. What should I take it home? Even I just saw her once, but why not? So she wrote her a very nice card and she gives it to this girl, who was the girl that opened the door for her. And when she had given the girl this card, this girl was so touched, this Jewish girl, and she just met her once and they spoke and she's giving her this beautiful card. She said, you must come and visit me. Right. So when this Arab girl opens the door, and lo and behold, there's Hannah, the girl that gave her the card. She's like, she came to visit me just like I told her to. She said, come in. It's so nice. You came to visit me. Hannah, meanwhile, was like pulling together all the details of the story. I forgot what happened. And here's so-and-so. And all these people from the hotel, they're all her family. They're all in the house. And she's like, okay, for like 15 minutes, she's socializing with everyone. Like exactly, this is what she came to do. And after like 15 minutes, she's like, this was such a nice visit, but I really have to get back. Where's the bus? This was of course what she wanted to know. Where's the bus that gets me out of East Jerusalem? They're like, there's no bus. Now there's no bus. It's like, what am I supposed to do? They're like, we'll drive you. So the girl and her uncle drove Hannah back from East Jerusalem back to the Jewish side. And they were going through the checkpoint and the soldier looks in the car. He sees 2 Arabs and a Jewish girl. He's like, are you okay? She said, yeah, these are my friends. Anyway, that's an example. The story goes on, but it was long enough. That's what we call, oh my gosh, that was such hashgacha pratis. That was so hand of God. Of any single home in the entire East Jerusalem, you knock on the door of the only people in the whole East Jerusalem that know you and they're your friends and they're going to take care of you and they're going to get you out. So when we hear something like that, or when we experience something in our own life, it's supposed to trigger in us an awareness that that's true for every single detail of our life. Just as we could take the story I just went and you could go through all the details and like, oh my gosh, that Arab girl with the coffee, that was her first night on the job, or the first night she saw her and she was there for 3 weeks. And oh my gosh, she had one extra card. She wasn't planning on giving to someone she just saw once. But she had this extra card. What should she do with it? And oh my gosh, she's such a nice girl that she wanted to literally go and give each worker a card. And oh my gosh, obviously that was a house she knocked on in the whole East Jerusalem. We do that. We could do the same thing for our life. Maybe not as such neon colors, but so many times things happen and we're like, whoa, exactly that, and exactly that, and exactly that. And that's how this whole thing came together. And God is doing that all day long, every second of our existence. It's such precise detail. It's not like, I happened to be here just when. There's no happened. In Hebrew, the word for happened in Hebrew is mikra. And if you jumble those letters, what that word happened, like it happened to be, turns into 2 words, rak, which means only, me Hashem, only from God. Happened, unjumbled, only from God. So when we're looking at our own life, we all have situations where we look and say, that was God. That doesn't make any sense. I was there. I was supposed to be here. That was happened. for good or the other direction. That's very precise. That's God. Anyone remember something in their life they'd like to share where they really was like, whoa, that was God? Rivka?
I'm just thinking, something strange happened, but I did, nothing came out of it. And the thing was like this. I was in Chicago before I met my husband. I had, I was talking to friends. They were from Kiev, and we talked for a long time, mutual friends. They lived in Boston. And then we lost touch. I lost touch of them. I knew, I never met them. I didn't know how they looked. And then 3-4 years later, I went on, my husband and I went on a honeymoon, and we were in south of France. We're working there, and my husband says, oh, I hear somebody speaks Russian. He thought everybody who speaks Russian has to speak to each other. And he just nudged me. He goes, talk to people. And I just said, hi, how are you? And we talked a little bit, and it turned out to be those people.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Kind of nothing. We were just so, both of us, we didn't realize it, but we just started talking. And they said, and the husband says, well, ask Rima if she knows of Vladimir, who lives in Chicago. And she said, don't be silly, Chicago is a big city. And then I looked at them and I go, what are your names? She repeated it, and then we realized we were for a long time, we were communicating on the phone.
So that's a perfect story of, it's the hand of God, but you don't know why.
I didn't know why.
And sometimes we don't know why because we don't know the rest of the story. And there are so many times like that. So why is Rivka sharing a story that she doesn't know the punchline? Because she knows that was weird. That was overt. She saw God's hands, but she doesn't know why he did that. And I've had those experiences too, where it's like, now again, as I said, and I want to repeat this again, it's a silly line to say that was hashgacha pratis, because that was hashgacha pratis implies an exclusivity. That was to the exclusion of everything else that seems normal. That's wrong. Everything is hashgacha pratis. Every detail is hashgacha pratis. So when we say that was hashgacha pratis, what we mean is that was overt enough that it's flying in my face. That was overt enough that I see God's hand. I don't understand it, but I don't understand many things about God. But I know he did something to orchestrate that we happened to overhear that Russian, and that my husband happened to say, go talk to them. And then why God you did that, I don't know, but I know you did it. And the story continues, and our lives continue. And there's so many stories and I mean, I could tell you story and story and story in other people's lives and in my own lives, where you just see God's hand. And sometimes it's like in Rivka's story, where I don't know what he was doing, but I know he worked to do that. Anyone else have something when they experienced that was overt? That was God being a little overt. Anyone else can think of an experience like that in their life? And honestly, it happens every single day. Happens every single day. And sometimes we just need the eyesight to see and the heart to feel that every single detail is God's specificity, is God wanting exactly it to happen like this. And it's a very strong principle to absorb, because we look at life differently then. We look at life very differently when we understand every single detail, the movement of a blade of grass, how much more so an animal, how much more so a human, how much more so a Jew. It's all very specific God handiwork. You happen to be late. You happen to be early. You happen to meet this person. You happen, orchestrated by God, orchestrated by God, orchestrated by God. Now the Rebbe here is taking this a step further. Because everything that we were just discussing, of course, is a known topic that I don't remember if we ever really spoke so much about Hashgacha Pratis in a class. I don't even remember really talking about it, but we've been learning for a long time, so I'm sure at some point it's come up. But the Rebbe is taking this a step further, and the Rebbe is saying it's not only the details of your life, that every single detail is orchestrated by God. And sometimes you see his hands, sometimes you see his point, and sometimes you don't see his hand and you don't see his point, but it's still him. The Rebbe says it's also events in the world. Like the Rebbe here is pointing a finger to a peace treaty, a global, international, worldwide peace treaty. The Rebbe is saying that's Hashgacha Pratis. That's not random. That's not, politicians wanting to get votes, wanting to impress voters, wanting to make a name for themselves, want to be written in a history book. The Rebbe says, no, that's Hashgacha Pratis. Now, that doesn't mean people might not, like sometimes things happen, and like, I'll compare it when Shalom Mordechai Rabashkin was freed a few years ago, you might remember, by President Trump. All the news analysts wrote up articles, and basically in the articles, they said this makes no sense. Why did he do it? Presidents, if they're going to do presidential pardon, it's to increase their voter allegiance. He's not increasing voter allegiance. The religious Jews already like him. They do it to get economic support for their campaigns. There was no money. Nobody at this point had any money, so they wasn't getting any money for it. They do it at the end of their term in office. Maybe they're leaving anyway. What do they care? He did it after a year. Like nothing that makes sense of why presidents give presidential pardons had anything to do with it. So why did he do it? That's what God wanted. There's a God. God wanted it. He did it. Whatever he was thinking, was he thinking something? I'm sure he was thinking something. Whatever it was irrelevant. God wanted it to happen and used him as a tool for it to happen. So anything in the world, the Rebbe is saying, especially in a big country, especially in a powerful country, especially in a country where there's a lot of Jews, it's divine providence. And we are supposed to look at it as such and say, so how am I supposed to look at this and understand what message is God giving me? Now, so this is a harder question. If you've ever actually had something happen in the world that you took a personal message from. In other words, to have something in our life, like let's go back to Rivka's story, whatever message she took, it was definitely like, whoa, hand to God. I don't know why he did that, but that was definitely him telling me something. Sometimes, you see whatever, different things happening. You're like, oh, there's God telling me something. There's God giving me a positive message. There's God this, there's God that. Have you ever seen that in the world? That something happened in the world. You heard it in the news and you felt God was giving you a message. I remember something that happened to someone here that they heard about in the news and they knew God was giving them a message. Anyone know what I'm talking about? Menucha, do you remember?
I have multiple stories.
Okay.
Yeah. I have many stories like that and many messages. I'm just not in the mood of
sharing.
talking.
So what I'm thinking is, after you had your whole crazy carbon monoxide miracle, a few, I don't remember, weeks or months later, there was this big tragedy in Chicago with another family that had a very similar situation, but it didn't end well. And I remember you saying, you yourself saw it on TV or something, or heard it, and then just in case you didn't, all your friends called you to tell you about it. And the message that your husband took from that was he needed to go to synagogue and thank God for the miracle. So again, That doesn't mean that that tragedy happened to those people exclusively for Menucha and her husband, but the hashgacha pratis of it happening and them being aware of it was to give them a message on something they needed to do in their own lives as they took from that, very significant event. So it's really true for all of us, both in the things that happen in our own life and in the things that happen in the world around us that we're aware of, that this is really ways that God is talking to us and he's giving us messages. So now the Rebbe is looking at this huge international event, this UN peace treaty by the heads of states of the Security Council of the UN, and saying this is a message for all of us. Of course, the example I gave, like with Menucha, was a specific event that happened. That was a specific message for her. But the Rebbe is saying here, this is big, this is huge, this is the world, and it's a message for all of us. And it's a message of how we should look at the world. So continuing, so the Rebbe says that when we're looking at this idea of the world coming together to declare we want peace, that was what was happening. Not just the representatives of the countries, the heads of states themselves gathered to officially, formally declare we want peace. And the Rebbe says that is because this is the time we're in. The message, the general message, of course, the Rebbe is going to go into many specific details, but the general message is that's where the world's holding. As the Rebbe keeps talking and talking and talking, that we are at the point in our history to change the entire course of history, and that the redemption, Moshiach, should happen for the whole world. The Rebbe says, look, that's the message we take from this. The world is officially, formally gathering to say, we're done. We're done spending money on defense budgets. We're done. We're not interested in that game anymore. We want peace. We want Moshiach now. Now we know, the Rebbe says, why are we saying this is so messianic for the people to say we don't want to spend money on our defense budgets? We want to use that money to help mankind. The Rebbe says because there's a very famous prophecy from Isaiah, from Yeshaya. Very famous prophecy. It's actually so famous, it's actually on the wall outside the United Nations in Manhattan. Prophecy is, and they will beat they'll beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. No longer will man fight, no longer will they teach each other war. This verse, this famous verse from Isaiah, from Yeshaya, is on the wall of the UN in Manhattan. And they will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning tools. And the Rebbe said that when the United Nations met and the heads of state of United Nations declared that we are not spending all this money on the defense budget anymore. That's a waste. We don't need it. And we're going to use that money to support mankind, to support humanity, to feed people of the world. That is the beginning of the fulfillment of these words of Isaiah. So when we hear these words and they'll beat their swords into plowshares, we're envisioning the sword and then somehow it becomes a plowshare and then the farmer is using it. And the Rebbe says, true. But the modern day expression of beating their swords into plowshares is taking the money of the defense budget and using it to provide food for people. That's beating their swords into plowshares. So when we look at this event in the world, we're looking at it, and the Rebbe says, look at it through its true reality, its messianic reality. The beginning of the fulfillment of one of the most famous prophecies we have about Moshiach began in the United Nations in February of 1992. Now, the Rebbe says, so when we look at this, what's the lesson in it for ourselves? What's the hashgacha pratis? We're supposed to take whatever's going on and say, okay, it's the hand of God. It's supposed to teach me something. So the first hashgacha pratis lesson we look from this is, I am supposed to take a personal lesson. Wow, the world is that ready for Mashiach. The world is that ready for Mashiach that this most famous nevuah of Isaiah, of Yeshaya, is already being fulfilled. So that's a pretty big sign the Rebbe is saying to look in the world and see Mashiach. Has anyone here ever experienced something in their life, something happened in the world around them, and they felt, whoa, that I didn't realize the world was that close to Mashiach? Like that really made them feel that things are shifting and the world is getting far closer to Mashiach than they realized? I think for me, it's every time I see again people being interested in God, non-Jews being interested and respectful towards Judaism or towards the Noahide laws. I think to me that always like makes me feel like, wow, we are so close to the redemption when the world, when the nations of the world, when the non-Jews are acting like they're going to act by Mashiach, that they're so respectful and interested in serving God and in serving God as Judaism understands serving God. That always, I always feel that very strongly. I think when I see, sometimes like in the news, you just see things or your experience of people just being like far nicer and kinder than you expect random people to be. And I'm also like, wow, like, these, people, like I would never expect just regular people in the world to be that nice and kind and sincerely thoughtful and helpful to strangers or something like that. Wow, that feels very Mashiach. Sometimes when you just hear when you see these random pictures and you're like, I remember once seeing some wolf lying with a lamb. It was some wild animal preserve or something. And there's this famous shot of this, wolf and lamb lying together. I was like, oh, wow, like we're really getting there. Or some farmer on the East Coast had a red heifer. It's like, oh, wow, we're really getting there. All these different things. And it's just like, again, I think it's looking at life with a certain set of eyes that as, you just sort of saying, oh, he's a nice guy, saying, wow, the world is shifting toward Mashiach. Wow, there's a red heifer. That's weird. Wow, the world is really shifting toward Mashiach. Wow, that person was so nice and kind and respectful of me. Wow, the world is really shifting toward Mashiach. So I think as you look at life in a certain way, you can see, I've definitely, like Menucha said about Hashgacha Pratis and countless stories. So I can't think of how many times things have happened in my life and it's been like, wow, Mashiach is that close for me to see the world behaving the way it is. Has anyone experienced something in their life that made them give them that like sense of like, wow, we're really close to Mashiach?
All the events, maybe COVID, maybe war that in Ukraine, like global events that, we never experienced before.
Right. It's true. It's true because you feel like something's happening and something big and something that is making the world feel very, very vulnerable. I think COVID for sure. I definitely felt it very strongly by COVID. I definitely felt COVID like this global I felt like God doing something that globally is going to bring the whole world to a state of vulnerability and awareness of him without the havoc of like a world war, God forbid, but like in a softer fashion than that, bringing the whole world to its knees and making the whole world aware of God. I remember God. I definitely felt that with COVID. I remember I was speaking to some person in the Philippines. I like, my daughter's flight got canceled. I had to call to get the money back. You know, one of those stories that I've had a lot of those during COVID, at the beginning of COVID, when all these flights were canceled and everything. My kids were stranded wherever in Israel. So I'm speaking to this lady in the Philippines in the middle of the night by us, whatever time, normal time was by them. And being me, I somehow brought the conversation to COVID and to God. And she's like, oh yeah, now every day I start off my day by praying. I pray to God. I turn to God. I ask for his protection. And it was like, I'm like, wow, like imagine, would I ever imagine that I'd be speaking to some random Philippine person, and like it was just so natural for the two of us to connect on this sense of needing to turn to God and praying to God. So yeah, I definitely felt that. Yes, you're right. COVID for sure was definitely that. And I'm sure for many people, the war is also, as we're probably not going to get to today, but I definitely wanted to speak about the war. That was the impetus for learning this in connection to the perspective the Rebbe is sharing here about how we're supposed to look at the events in the world, and especially, as the Rebbe is going to discuss, war and peace. So that was definitely a true one that really, I think, resonated for many people, Moshiach. Anyone else had something that they've experienced that it happened and they felt, oh, wow, that's a sign of Moshiach, or that's bringing Moshiach, or that means Moshiach's coming? Think about it. Again, sometimes, like Menucha said, there's so many things, but it's hard to like know which one to talk about. So you just start putting it aside, or maybe you never processed things that way before, but think, because there are, as Faye came up with two very quickly that are very big, real ones for all of us. So the Rebbe says that this idea of saying, oh, wow, that's Mashiach. That shows Mashiach's coming, that these nations are having this peace treaty. You could say, like, why are we connecting it? Peace treaty, UN, the heads of state came, cool. But why are we saying Mashiach? Why are we jumping from that cool or nice or positive development? Or you could be cynical and say, they don't really mean it, it's just for show development, but however you want to look at it, why are we connecting to Mashiach? So the Rebbe says, because we are in the high time for the coming of Mashiach. That's where we are in the cosmic calendar. That's where we are holding spiritually, based on everything, that's all the good that we've done and all the suffering that we've experienced, everything the world has gone through. We're at the time. So therefore, since now is the time, we are at this time when it is happening so soon. When we look at anything in the world, and especially anything big and huge and international, nothing's random. I don't remember how many years ago, a number of years ago, there was like this crazy blackout in New York for like 3 or 4 days. I don't know if any of you remember. I don't remember how many years ago it was. It was quite a while ago. I think they claimed in the end, like some squirrels chewed through some wires, if that makes any sense. But like the whole New York, like did not have electricity for like 3 or 4 days. And I remember, and I'm sitting in Chicago, of course, we have electricity. So sometimes when everything's fine by you and, in another place, people are really suffering, it almost makes you feel like, not guilty, but like everything's okay by me, but I know there's a lot of people now that are really suffering. But I remember so clearly, I was driving, thinking about it. And I remember thinking, I know this has to do with bringing Mashiach. I don't know what. I don't know why. I don't know why a 3-4 day blackout in New York is going to I don't know. It was in 2004. Okay, wow, 18 years ago. I know it was a long time ago. 18 years ago. Imagine 18 years ago. I have this very clear memory. I'm driving in Chicago and thinking, I know this has to do with the saga of Moshiach. And I remember thinking to myself, when Moshiach comes, this is like my story to myself. I'm not saying this is true. This is a story I tell myself, that just like after the miracle of Purim, they wrote a Megillah, right? We know that, Megillah Esther. We hear it every year in synagogue twice, by night and by day of Purim. And when you're hearing the Megillah read at a normal pace, about 40 some minutes, if it's my husband and in a rush, he could probably do it in about 15.